it's me, Lois, with Aussie Lozzie Knit Designs, and this is your nitty gritty roadmap to learn to knit workshop. We are in day 2, and we have a lot of ground to cover. All right, so we are in day 2, and so if you watched the video yesterday, or if you didn't get a chance to, which is totally fine, I just want to give you a quick recap. So yesterday's video was just all about what the workshop is and what kinds of things I'm going to cover in it, and we kind of just talked about the struggles of being a beginner knitter and how it can be really difficult to find the right information, the best information, and not get overwhelmed with the contradictory information that is basically everywhere. There's so many amazing free resources, but when you're brand new and you don't even know like anything, right, about knitting, that's how I was, it can become really confusing really fast. And my goal here is to make this all very clear, very simple. And so we're going to just clear away all the fog, all the overwhelm, all of the contradictory stuff. We're just going to try to focus on what's most important so that you can learn to knit, because it's such a cool hobby and it's something that I love to do, and it's relaxing and it's comforting and it's meditative. And when you're done, you can actually wear a sweater that you knit if that's what you want to do. So today we're going to talk about something that's super important, which is the supplies. So when we talk about knitting supplies, we're talking about knitting needles and yarn, okay? And there are more supplies that you can get as a beginner, right? Like scissors and tapestry needle and all of those things. But for this workshop, we want to focus on the knitting needles and the yarn, because those are the two things that have the most impact on us while we're trying to learn to knit. You can, go to the store and pick out any kind of needles that you want and any kind of yarn that you want, and then it may not go well. And because you don't know, you may think that it's your fault, like you're not learning how to knit correctly or you've done something wrong. I think that's perfectly reasonable. That's how most people respond when we can't do something, we blame ourselves. However, I actually think that the right tools and materials go a long way, a really long way, in helping you learn how to knit successfully. And so we're going to just spend some time talking about those things. All right, so first on the list, we're going to be talking about knitting needles. Knitting needles come in different types, different materials. They're made out of like wood or metal or whatever, and then they also are different sizes, okay? So first we're going to take a look at the different types of knitting needles. There are circular or interchangeable needles, and I put these in the same category, but there is a little bit of a difference between them. So when people say circular needles, they could mean interchangeable needles, or they could mean fixed. Typically, when someone says circular, they wouldn't say fixed, they would just say circular. But if they're talking about circular needles, but they're interchangeable, they almost always specify that they're interchangeable. So let's talk about what these needles are. If you look at the picture on the slide, it's the one that has like the 2 needle points and then a cable going between it. So it's like a circle, circular needles. If they are fixed circular needles, then the needle points are permanently fixed to that cable. So you cannot take it apart unless you break them. Don't break your needles. Now, if they're interchangeable, that cable will actually unscrew from the knitting needle. And so the cable comes off, it's separate, and you can put on a different size and screw it on, and that's super handy. So circular or interchangeable needles are used for knitting in the round or knitting flat. And in fact, you would use them for knitting very, very large pieces flat. So like you could get a 60-inch cable and knit up a blanket using those interchangeable needles, and it will knit like a flat piece of fabric. Okay, so then the other kind of knitting needles is your double pointed needles. These are in the slide that have a point on either end. And it shows a picture of, I think, 4 needles. And that's pretty standard because when we're knitting with double pointed needles, we're usually knitting in the round, and we would need 4 or 5 needles to be able to knit in the round that way. Now, you can use these, like I said, for knitting in the round, but they can also be used for knitting flat, so long as the width of your fabric is not greater than the length of your needle. Because if it is, then your knitting is going to fall off the other end, and you might lose some of your knitting that you just worked so hard on. So you can use them for flat, but be a little bit cautious. And then the final pair that I want to show you guys is straight knitting needles. These are the ones that have the little stopper on the end. These are the classic, iconic knitting needles that we all think of when we think of knitting, right? We think of Granny rocking out in her chair with Tweety Bird, you know, in the cage. These are the very, very iconic knitting needles that we just think of when we think of knitting. And so they are only used for knitting flat. They are not used for knitting in the round, flat only. And so even though it may seem like they're the least versatile in the bunch, I actually recommend that beginners start with straight knitting needles. And the reason I recommend that is because you can buy them pretty inexpensively in all the sizes, right? All the sizes. And that little stopper on the end is going to keep your knitting from falling off the end, like we talked about. And it also doesn't have that cable, which when you're a beginner can get in your way and just cause extra frustration. And I think that learning to knit can be frustrating. So we want to minimize any of the frustrations that we possibly can from the onset. So we're going to do straight knitting needles. Next, we're going to talk about the best material. So knitting needles also come in different materials. It comes in metal, like I talked about before. You can get wooden and you can get plastic. So I recommend that you get wooden needles when you're a beginner. And the reason for that is that wooden knitting needles have a little bit of stickiness to them. And so they kind of hold on to the yarn more easily, which is great because metal needles are the opposite, right? Things will just fly off those needles. And so when you're trying to hold everything, it kind of helps if you have a knitting needle that's also helping you hold things and, you know, stitches aren't flying off the end. And so you could also use plastic. Plastic is pretty good. It also has a bit of stickiness depending on the plastic. Uh, and I would also like to say that if you have metal needles already and you're like, I don't want to buy new ones, that's okay. But if you've been trying to knit and you're using metal needles, if you're getting pain in your hands, you may want to try switching to wooden needles because actually metal needles can cause you to have pain in your hands. That is true for me. And so I mostly always use wooden needles. Those are my favorite. That's not the only reason I'm recommending them. There's lots of good reasons for beginners, but wooden is definitely my favorite. I also use a lot of plastic, and I do occasionally use metal if it's a smaller project. But for beginners, I think definitely wooden or plastic, and try to avoid metal if you can. Okay, and then we're going to talk sizes. So knitting needles come in so many sizes. I think the smallest size is 1/4 of a millimeter. It could be wrong, but I think it's been a while since I did this presentation. But I think it goes like 1/4 of a millimeter all the way up to like a 15 millimeter. Like these are big honking needles, right? And so what's best for a beginner? Well, not the teeny tiny 1 millimeter knitting needles. Those are used for making things like lace. And once you're there, absolutely, absolutely make lace and use the skinny, tiny needles. But when you're new, you become all fingers and it's hard to maneuver things because there's just not enough needle for your hands to hold on and your hands feel like really big and awkward. So we don't want that to happen. But then on the other end, right, we don't want to have huge needles where we're like all needles and not enough hands and fingers. We need a happy middle place to be. And so I recommend that you start with a size 5 millimeter knitting needle. You could go down to like a size 4 millimeter, and then 4.5 is fine, 5 or 5.5. But I would not go above a 5.5, and I wouldn't go below a 4 as a beginner. And the good news is that this size knitting needle that I'm recommending is going to go perfectly with the yarn weight that I'm going to recommend later on. But so just to say that again, you want to get 4 millimeter, 4.5 millimeter, 5 millimeter, or 5.5 millimeter. And that's going to be a really good size for you. One more note about the knitting needles. Well, I just want to say the things again. So you want to get wooden, straight, and a knitting needle in the size 4 millimeter, 4.5 millimeter, 5 millimeter, or 5.5 millimeter, and not greater than 6 or 6 or greater, and not smaller than a 4 millimeter. Okay, so the next part of this workshop today is going to be yarn. Yarn is one of my favorite topics. I could talk about yarn all day, ask my family. They don't really listen, and I can't say I blame them. But okay, so yarn is so much fun that I think that a lot of us knitters actually get addicted to knitting because we love yarn so much. And so there's this common like saying in the knitting world that we have two hobbies. One is knitting and the other is collecting yarn. Because we all end up with these huge stashes of yarn that I don't think we'll ever be able to knit ourselves out of, myself included. And I try to like pump the brakes on buying it, but I always find a good excuse to buy new yarn. All right, so we're going to talk about the best yarn. Yarn, just like our knitting needles, is going to come in different weights. It's going to come in different fibers. And so we're just going to get into all of that good stuff. So I recommend, right off the bat, I'll just tell you, I recommend that you get a worsted weight, like around a weight 4 if you're reading the little yarn symbol on your label, in a cotton, 100% cotton yarn. Okay, and the reason why I recommend that you get 100% cotton worsted weight 4 is because the worsted weight 4 goes really well with the size needles that I just told you to get. But also, cotton yarn is just like the wooden or the plastic needles where it has a little bit of stickiness. It is not a slippery yarn. So you don't have to worry about it flying off your knitting needles when you're making a stitch and you maybe tug a little too hard, which is very common as a beginner. It's super common to accidentally drop a stitch that way. The cotton and the wooden together, or the cotton and the plastic together, they're going to kind of hold on to each other better. Also, cotton retains its shape a little bit easier. It's a depending on the cotton yarn that you get. Some of them, like Sugar and Lilies, that one is pretty stiff, and so it will actually hold its shape. So if you did drop it, you could just stick your needle right back in where it should be and go on with your knitting. So I do recommend worsted weight 4, 100% cotton. Then I want to talk about, oh, this slide is all messed up, about all the different kinds of yarns that you can get and how they're made, because they're made differently, right? And it actually impacts you. So before we get into all that detail, I think what I should tell you is our main objective. Our main objective as beginner knitters is that we get a very good stitch definition. And that means that when you knit a stitch, you can look at it and you can see exactly what's going on with that stitch. So when you're done knitting a piece of fabric, you can look at it and see if maybe you didn't have even tension or weird things were happening. If you don't get a yarn that will show you that good stitch definition, it's going to be really difficult for you to see how you can improve. But also, if you think you can get a yarn that kind of hides stitch definition to hide your beginner knitter mistakes, then I have some bad news. because it actually does the opposite. It's going to magnify those mistakes. It's hard to knit with those yarns that are real, I don't know, like bouncy or whatever, because um, if you're a good knitter, if you're, you've been knitting a while and you're very good and even with your tension, you can make it look great. But if you're still new, it's going to be really hard to manage that yarn. So we want great stitch definition. We want yarns that are easy to work with, and that is our main objective. Okay, so yarn is put together in different ways. So the one that I recommend, of course, is cotton, and it's most commonly found as a plied yarn. So if you get this kind of yarn, it's like a 4-ply or 8-ply or 12-ply. Most cotton yarns that are in the worsted weight are going to be an 8-ply. A ply is just a really long string of fiber, and then it is twisted together tightly with other strings of the same fiber or different depending on the yarn. And it's twisted really tightly so that it is just one strand of yarn, right? But it's actually made up of many strands. And so if you aren't sure if your yarn is plied, when you go yarn shopping, you should feel very comfortable digging into the yarn a little bit. And if you go to like any yarn store, you'll probably see that somebody's been digging in them. That's why they're always kind of messed up a little bit. It's because a knitter was in there and was like, I'm just checking this out really closely. It's a good thing to do. So don't feel embarrassed, just go for it. If you can get to an end, that's the best, because then you could kind of pull it apart and see, is it plied or something else? And you can look at that end. It's really good to do that. So some things that you want to do is go ahead and get the plied yarns. The plied yarns are great. In this picture, I have a bunch of different plied yarns in different fibers. So at the top, that purple is a cotton yarn. The one beneath that is a wool. The one beneath that is another wool, the orange, and that wool is from Knit Picks. I can't remember which one it is, but it is. And then the bottom one is actually a yak wool blend. And so I would tell you, if it's a plied yarn, get it. Plied yarns are great. They have excellent stitch definition. They're usually very uniform. They're excellent, excellent kinds of yarns to get. And so let's talk about another kind of yarn, which is a filament yarn. Filament yarn is usually one, maybe more strand of a fiber that looks like it's been mushed together. Sometimes if you look closely, it looks like it was crocheted into a long chain. If you know what that looks like, it kind of looks like they crocheted a chain together, and that is the yarn. That is a filament yarn, okay? It can have one or more strands, and this is a good yarn to get. Filament yarn is good to get. It comes again in a variety of different fibers, and I think you're going to find it mostly like in your polyester acrylic kind, but there are, some that have wool or whatever. It's cotton. I've seen cotton filament yarns, and so it can come in different fibers as well. What you want to be careful of, I just want to point out on the picture here, the top one is a white yarn, and it looks like it's changing widths. It isn't. That's an optical illusion. It's actually two strands that are bound together very loosely. That's how you would, that's the difference between plied and filament with more than one strand. Plied is bound together very tightly, right? And then filament is loosely. Okay, so it's actually two strands, and it's an optical illusion that it's changing widths. It's not actually doing that. But the one beneath it, the yellow one, is absolutely doing that. And so you want to be cautious when you get a filament yarn, and that's why I say kind of pull out some of the strands and look at them. Is it getting fatter and thinner, fatter and thinner? If it is, don't get it. But if it's like a continuous width, then that is a good one to get. That is definitely a good one to get. Okay, so then we have single strands. This could be, it just looks like it's one single strand of yarn. And but it doesn't always have just one strand of yarn. And so I say to use use caution when you are looking at this kind of yarn. So for example, the one at the top here, the blue, it looks like it's one strand, but it actually has all these very fine little silvery hairs, and it will grab onto your knitting needles when you're trying to knit. And that just makes it hard when you're a beginner. So you just avoid that for now. The other problem with that yarn is that it makes it really hard to see your stitch definition. And again, we want to see our stitch definition. So I would use caution on that. The one underneath is a purple with a metallic string in it. That one, it's very fuzzy, but also that metallic string can come separated from the rest of the yarn, wrap around your knitting needle, and cause like a little bit of a snag happening. So I would use caution. You can get them if you want to. Like I think the one in the bottom of this picture is a blend. I can't remember what it was, but anyway, it's just beautiful yarn, and it worked really well. So anyway, so then there are singles, another kind of single stranded looking yarn that is not single stranded, and it's not a ply either. I like to call this like baby hair yarn. And if you see this in the wild at the store, you'll know exactly what I mean, because it looks like it's one strand, but once you kind of like rub it with your fingers, you'll see that it separates into all these fine, tiny, thin hairs, like baby hair. And so that's why I call it that. These are okay to use as a beginner. Just be careful because the baby hairs, it's not like it's plied. And so it's really easy to stick your needle in between some of the baby hairs and get a snag. If you did that with your plied yarn, the good thing is that it's like it's a pretty substantive uh, piece of yarn that you could move over to where it needs to be. I don't know why I'm having trouble with words today. It's a pretty substantial piece of yarn that you could move over to where it needs to be. But with the finey baby hairs, you may not actually see that you've got a hair on the wrong side. You will definitely feel it. So you can get this kind of yarn, but again, I would use some caution. So there are some yarns that you should definitely avoid as a beginner. And that is the chenille yarns. It's so awful to tell you that because I know like these are your blanket or your velvet yarns. And so when you go to the store, like if you bring your kids or your nieces and nephews or anybody who loves stuffed animals, and you're like, pick out a yarn and I'll knit you something. Inevitably, they're going to be drawn to this kind of yarn because the blanket type yarn looks like a stuffed animal. Like it just already looks like a stuffed animal. You just want to squish it all day. And the velvet is shiny and it's beautiful and it feels amazing. But for a beginner knitter, it is really hard to work with. It is very, very difficult to work with this yarn because even though it may not look like it, I like to call these like worm yarns. I don't know if you guys know worms. When I grew up in Colorado, like it would rain and worms would be out and about, and we were stupid kids and we didn't actually think we were being mean. So just keep that in mind. But we would take the worms and they would be all fat, right? And then we'd kind of stretch them out on the concrete because they'd get so skinny and it was so fascinating to us. We weren't trying to pick on them. I feel so bad. I'm sorry, worms. But that's what this yarn is like too. Only when it stretches out, it doesn't get skinnier. It stays the same thickness. I don't know how it does it. But what happens a lot of times is if you aren't familiar with tension or you don't have good tension and you're trying to knit with this yarn, this is the movement I make when I'm knitting. But if you're like trying to knit with that yarn and you don't have good tension, then what ends up happening is that it seems like it's fine. And then later, you're going to have giant loops in your knitting. You're going to just have giant loops and awkward things. So I actually want to pause for just a quick second and show you all the way back from yesterday, this slide. Okay, this blanket that's in the picture here is a blanket that I knit using a blanket yarn. I think it was Bernat baby blanket for a friend who was going to have a baby. And I was not a new knitter at this point. I had been knitting for a while. This is actually a pretty complicated stitch pattern, so I think I would categorize it as an intermediate knit given the stitch pattern. And you can see that like I just had no tension whatsoever, even though I kind of did know what I was doing. There's giant holes, there's like the cast on edge and the bind off edge are way tighter than the rest of the blanket. It's, yeah. And those holes are caused by the fact that this yarn scrunches up on itself and then stretches. And you just don't know what it's going to do unless you've been knitting a long time and you know how to go ahead and work with it. Okay, let me go back. Where were we? We're picking on Chanel yarns. Anyway, so you definitely want to avoid Chanel yarns for now. Once you feel very comfortable with your tension and you think you can do it, go ahead and knit with them. They're fun and they're so soft. Okay, so if you thought I was just going to be picking on the fiber of yarn and the size of yarn, then you were mistaken, my friend, because I'm also going to be picking on colors. And I'm sorry because I can't get my slideshow to work properly, so you're just going to have to bear with me in these pictures. So I'm just going to move them around a little bit. All right, so number one, I recommend that you knit with a solid color yarn. I just do. Solid color yarns are going to give you this gorgeous stitch definition. Oops, I did not mean to do that. So that even when you're new, like, whoops, you can actually look at this. You can look at this and you can see the stitches. And that's what we want as beginners. We want that very clear stitch definition so that we can see what we're doing, so that we can improve what we're doing. We don't want it to be fuzzy. We don't want it to be something that we can't see well. So you can see here, this is just a stack of solid colored dishcloths that I made, and you can see all those stitches really well. So you don't want to get this kind of yarn right here. This is, I'm trying to bring it up. Let me move that out of the way. It went from a slideshow presentation to me dragging pictures around. Okay, this one right here. This is a short changing color yarn. So what I mean by that is if you go, it's going to be so cute. I love this yarn in a skein. It looks so beautiful because it has all these colors popping out one right after the other, and each of them is about 2 to 3 inches in length before it changes to the next color. And it's so beautiful, but it's not great for beginners because it makes it really hard to see those stitches. And we need to be able to see our stitches. We just need to be able to see them. If I knit with this, I can't really tell where stitches are ending and beginning. There's a lot of optical illusion happening here, and so it's just not the best choice for a beginner. Once you know what you're doing and you have good stitch definition anyway, and you learn how to see stitches, right? That's another piece of this. Then you can go ahead and use that yarn. Another one to avoid is going to be this kind of yarn. This is like your speckled yarns. So if you choose something like the blue-white one where it's not very different in shades, like it's blue and white, but it's pretty even, you can see the stitch definition in that one. But be careful because if you get one that's like black and white or something, you're going to lose that stitch definition. It's going to become hard to see. And just like the speckled yarns, which I love speckled yarns, who doesn't? They're so fun with the little speckles, but for a beginner knitter, those speckles become like blind spots in our knitting stitches, so that it makes it really hard for us to see what exactly is going on. And we want this to be as simple as possible. So what do you do if you don't want to knit with solids? Guys, solids are the best, but if you don't want to knit with solids, then you could knit with a striped yarn. A striped yarn is going to be similar to the first one that I said not to get with the color changing, but it's going to be way different because it's going to have like large sections of one color. Like it'll be one color for a couple of yards and then switch over to the next color. Mostly these yarns are called striping yarns, and so it'll be easy for you to identify them. And as you can see, like just like the solids, look at how clearly we can see these stitches. And it's because there's a block of them in one color before it changes to a block in another color. And we like that stitch definition. It makes it easier for us to see our stitches, count our stitches, and do all of that good stuff. So you could get stripes or a variegated if the variegated is changing colors very slowly, and it usually like shifts gradually from one color to the other, which makes seeing the stitches easier than just like a hard stop and switch in the color like what we're seeing in the stripes. Okay, so let's do a wrap up of the yarn, shall we? So you should get a worsted weight number 4, 100% cotton in a solid, but do not get black. Just for now, when you are comfortable with knitting and you know what you're doing, knit with black all you want. I love knitting with black. It's so beautiful. It really is. I love black. And if you do knit with black, make sure you use the hashtag knit like Batman. I'm trying to get that to be a thing. Anyway, but avoid it for now, just for now, in any really dark colors, because actually it's hard to see when you're knitting with a dark color. So just like we need to see our stitch definition, we also need to be able to see everything that's happening. And with a really dark yarn, that becomes difficult to do. So avoid dark colors for now. So worsted weight 4, 100% cotton, plied yarn in a solid or a stripe, avoid black. And one thing that I forgot to mention earlier too is also avoid fuzzy yarns. I know, it's so mean because we like the fuzz, right? It's so soft. In fact, I'm knitting something right now with Knit Picks Wonder Fluff, and I'm not affiliated or sponsored. It's the first time I've ever used that yarn, and it is so luxurious and soft. I would not recommend that for a beginner ever because it just gets kind of difficult to see the stitches and it gets hard to work with if you're new. Anyway, we're going to wrap up today. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about the foundational knit skills. It will be shorter than today's video, but there's going to be a lot of really good information, so I hope that you can join me then. And until tomorrow, I hope y'all have a good evening. Bye-bye.